Hey, you know what? I can't tell what goes in there. Whatever, man. All right, so, all right, let's go ahead and do the drawing real quick. Hey, Josh. Go ahead and...
It's remarkable that any of you still want to drink today. I admire your persistence.
So we've got Ben Doyle from Thales.
Congratulations, Ben. Drink like a champion tonight.
All right, there you go. All right, cool. Thanks, Josh. All right, so I'm Skip Duckwall. I work with Accuvant. This is Will Peteroy. He works with MSRC. And here at the bottom, we have this number 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. So if anyone happens to know, I saw your hand first. Very good. Avogadro's number. Yep, no problem, man. Just, yeah, take a sip and pass it around, I think. Anyway, we're here to talk about persistence. Loosely defined, it's access to an asset or a network that's long-term access. So compromise that continues throughout, many hours, days, potentially years, depending on what's going on. Something bad guys typically want. They want to come back. They want to visit your network. They want to mine everything they can out of it before moving on, seeing what else gets generated. And for a lot of pen testers, it's not really something that we deal with because most of our stuff is we're in and out. We're grabbing the the boss's bourbon stash as quickly as possible, usually in a week or so. And then that's the end of our involvement. We write the report and move on to the next guy. So we haven't really seen anybody that's really talked about an overview of what persistent methods are out there. We wanted to talk about some of the tools of the trade that we've seen bad guys use and that other people use. And talking with some network defenders, noticed that there's been a number of people I've talked with that didn't really have a good grasp of what persistence was or various persistence methods that were out there. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk on. We really think this is both an offensive and a defensive talk because we think that there's probably things that pen testers can, if they're looking to prove a point, or it could be part of, something that you try to use on your engagements. I think that there's some stuff that hopefully people can use here. But we also want to point at it, look at it from a defender standpoint. What would it take to defend against what we've got? And then, what it takes to detect it as well. We're not going to go into a lot of great depth because this is the teach it track after all. But most of this stuff, there's copious amounts of research material that's available online. Look through forum archives, look through con talk archives, DEF CON archives. Just it's all out there, and if there's enough interest, we've thought about maybe starting up something that sort of starts cataloging individual methods in each one of our categories. Not sure if there's enough interest there for us to. There's a lot of stuff. So anyway. So in the spirit of keeping this kind of like easy to read, we're going with the stoplight thing. So low, medium, high, relative level of difficulty for offensive, defensive, and detective. So probably best used with an example. I'm probably not going to go over the difficulty levels in the top every time, but I'll start with it here. So from an offensive standpoint, well, first off, physical man in the middle. Attacker gains physical access to your building, workspace, whatever, plugs a device in between a computer on your network and the rest of the world. So pwn plug, rogue AP, something like that. From an offensive standpoint, you have to have physical access to the building, which may raise the bar beyond some people, but other entities that are out there may have always wanted to visit your hometown. From a defensive standpoint, it really involves a user understanding everything that needs to be or should be under his desk. How many of your users can identify, a pwn plug on site? I've been on an assessment before where an APB was put out building-wide for a pwn plug. Here's a picture of what it looks like. Everyone go search their desks. But, Exactly. So, I mean, you're putting a lot on the user to be able to figure that out. And then detection requires physical inspection. So, number 2, we've got firmware. So, an attacker gains access and either adds value to the firmware or gains access to the underlying OS. A lot of devices actually have a fully functioning Linux implementation under the hood, so if they can break out of the web app and access the underlying functionality, they can use Netcat or SSH or any number of other built-in Unix tools to do what they wanted to. So from an offensive standpoint, you either need to have the equipment and understand what's going on so you can reflash it, or you need to be able to gain access to the supply chain, or you need to know that the underlying is a piece of Linux or something very similar and be able to break through the application to get to it. From a defensive standpoint, there really isn't any good way. I mean, we don't really have a good way to tell you that the firmware for every device you have is actually the right firmware. It's trusted from the supplier. So you can't really trust a live checksum off the device itself, because if I own the device, I can modify the checksum on the fly. And detection, you might be able to pick up something with physical inspection, but realistically, you're not going to be able to pick it up. BIOS UEFI. There's real-world malware that uses this, modifies the MBR, partitions, the volume boot record. This is actively used in the real world by some very sophisticated pieces of banking malware. From an offensive standpoint, you have to really understand the boot process, which I don't think there's that many people in the world that truly understand everything that's going on from start to finish for some of the more complicated boot processes that are out there. From a defensive standpoint, you have to fully implement a trusted boot process, which is extremely difficult to do. I mean, every year at Black Hat, there's another UEFI talk. And then, there really isn't a good detection method. Hypervisors. This is kind of an interesting one because it bridges the gap between hardware and software and acts as an intermediary between the two. So if you gain access to the hypervisor, you can gain access to the resources, the memory disk shares, the shared resources amongst the VMs. In some cases, you can run commands from the hypervisor itself that execute on the device from an offensive standpoint. From a defensive standpoint, really about the best thing you can do is patch, which is, is what it is. Once again, you don't really have anything that tells you that the state of the hypervisor is good. It's just sort of trusted that it works because everything works. And same thing with detection. There's no really good detective capabilities for it. Windows registry is always fun. There's tons of places inside the Windows registry that run automatically. You can modify file associations. You can add debuggers to automatically run every time a process gets run. You can have triggers that fire off whenever certain conditions are met. And data can be written to the registry without creating files on the disk because the registry itself is virtualized when the machine boots. So you don't have a good disk-based capability. You have to look at the registry that's created for that user in memory to see what's being written to it. It's difficult to prevent because a lot of the auto runs are especially well documented, but because the user can modify their own registry and has their own settings for various things, they can overwrite it, and it becomes a very difficult problem to try to try to figure out. Detection, because it's well documented, you can automate a lot of the detections for auto runs, startup folder, you know, whatever, but it's still, it's painful. It's something that you have to spend a lot of time thinking about, and then it's fairly easy to do, but to scale it is going to require some effort. Startup scripts and folders. On Windows, you have the startup folder, you have the all user startup folder, and then Unix has startup scripts. And the config levels run, or you know, the files get run at different config levels. And from an offensive standpoint, if you gain it, you know, admin access to the box, you can add stuff to the startup folders or to modify the scripts. From a defensive standpoint, it's extremely well documented, so very few places to go look. So it's fairly easy to look for it. But detective capabilities is kind of difficult just from a having to watch for files getting modified and keeping track of file integrity monitoring or something like that. It's really easy to detect if you know that a machine is compromised, that something is wrong, but if you have, you know, hundreds of machines on your network and you have to go look individually at each one, it gets kind of painful. Drivers and kernel modules. Attacker gains access and modifies or adds value to the kernel. From an offensive standpoint, at least on the Windows side, this requires a fair amount of skill. It's easy to create a module. It's hard to keep it running. It's hard to keep the kernel from blue screening unless you understand everything that's going on, which is difficult to do in a kind of a black box situation. On the Linux side, it's a little easier to at least debug because you have all the source code for the kernel to play with. From a defensive standpoint, the kernel is what you trust. So you can't really trust anything once the kernel's popped. Driver signing helps at least mitigate it. You know, hopefully you don't lose a driver cert by some manufacturer, but you know, unfortunately that happens. And PatchGuard on Windows, which is internal consistency and integrity checks for the kernel, makes it more difficult to get it running, but more difficult doesn't mean impossible. And then detection is, you know, very difficult to do because you're not normally allowed access to see what the kernel is running, at least on the Windows side. On the Linux side, you can do an ls mod, but there's any number of ways to get around having your kernel module show up. So once it's already there and in the kernel, you know, it's really hard to actually see that something is wrong. Passwords. It's how users attain persistence on your network. So they're very portable. Many people use lousy passwords. I think we all know that. And then we're also lumping Kerberos tickets into this as well because they're more or less portable as well with TGTs. But you know, from an offensive standpoint, you know, people use lousy passwords. This is the bane of most administrators' existence. From a defensive standpoint, you know, there's only so much you can do. You can try enforcing, you know, more complexity. You can try to force longer passwords, but unfortunately, it is what it is. And detective capability is purely after the fact. You have to monitor access logs and keep an eye on what a normal user's activity is to know that their password has been compromised. And even then, you know, you don't necessarily stand a good chance of figuring it out. Executable replacement. Windows has several executables that go to hotkeys. So like hit shift 5 times and sticky keys comes up. You hit Windows U and utilman shows up. You hit Windows P and the display manager.exe shows up. You can also use a tool called iExpress, which is built into Windows to bind 2 executables together. So whenever you run the normal executable, the other executable gets executed for free in the background. And it's reasonably transparent. From an offensive standpoint, it requires admin privileges or physical access to the box, at least for the hotkey related stuff. And sometimes it's hard to trigger. Like you have to have RDP access or physical access to the box. You can trigger the setHC, for example, over an RDP session just by hitting shift 5 times. So if you replace command.exe with, or you replace sethc with command.exe, fire up an RDP connection to that remote box and hit shift 5 times, it'll pop up on the remote box. Defensive standpoint, code signing and whitelisting are your best bets, but even then, command.exe and PowerShell.exe are signed and trusted by Microsoft. So if I replace one of those binaries with a different binary that's signed, it will still likely get executed. File integrity monitoring is really the only way that you're going to be able to pick up on that. Backups and volume shadow copy. Windows has this really cool feature where it'll take a snapshot of what you've got going on and then maintain that snapshot so you can go access files out of it. That includes executables. So you have to be able to force a snapshot from an offensive standpoint. You copy a file onto the system, you force the snapshot, then you delete the file, and now the file is available in the snapshot for you to access. Most AV products don't look at it, at snapshots and the backups. It's actually kind of a pain in the ass to access them, but it's there, it works, it's been talked about at cons. So really the only good viable defense is to disable the functionality or wipe old snapshots, which may or may not interfere with normal backup operations. And there really isn't a good way to detect it because it's hard to go through and look at the snapshots because this is not really what they were meant to be there for. DLL path hijacking, there's very similar analog on the Linux side with libraries as well. Basically, you're exploiting the fact that there's a path that is searched for libraries and other code that gets looked at when you run an executable. And so the attacker can basically take advantage of relative paths, absolute paths, and search chains. From an offensive standpoint, you have to know what's going on. You have to know the path that's being searched. On Windows, it's fairly well documented. With Linux, you can change it up somewhat with environmental variables, but for the most part, it's fairly well known. From a defensive standpoint, binary whitelisting with the DLLs with the full path and enforcing only those DLLs can be loaded. And file integrity monitoring can pick it up, but you have to use it as more of an exception. This file came up in this location, and then it doesn't really scale that well across large enterprises. Somewhat similar to the path, DLL path problem is this unquoted path problem, which is in Windows, the default search order is it takes a string, it goes to the first space, and then it appends like .exe. So you have :program files /Microsoft Office / whatever. The first thing it will try to run is :program.exe if the path is not enclosed in quotes. So there's actually drivers, there's services, there's a lot of things that actually have these unquoted paths that will inadvertently trigger this particular functionality. So you have to understand and know what's there. I think there's actually something in Metasploit that'll look for it. From the defensive standpoint, you just have to get it right and use the damn quotes. This thing's been around forever and it's still around. Don't modify the default OS permissions for C, and then file integrity monitoring can help, but it's still kind of, look for stuff where this would normally be. So make sure there isn't a :program.exe or :common.exe or any of the file names that could possibly be in the path.
All right, so this slide is really more about persistence techniques that are not really standard. So like we put Trojans up there, but it's not just an executable that could be up there. Like Trojans in the sense of the slide, we're really talking about document file formats, possibly macros in certain document file formats. Really just anywhere where you can have something that looks legitimate, runs, but also there's value added there in that actual startup. So either when that is accessed, executed at that time. So essentially, we see some examples like fake antivirus, again, yeah, file formats. As far as defense, you can do application whitelisting. However, essentially, like if it's part of the normal functionality of the document file format or part of the normal functionality of the program, and that's really where the backdoor is, the whitelisting is not really going to help there. As far as detection goes, file integrity monitoring, if you can notice when something new is added to the system, there's a chance of detecting it there. Memory resident code execution is something that we're seeing a lot more of these days. It's essentially where an attacker just directly loads their code into memory. You can do that with Rundle32, you can do that with load library, create remote thread. As far as defense goes, these are core functionalities of the operating system. As far as detection goes, these can be part of, like you can essentially acquire memory resident tools or memory resident binaries through a forensic dump. However, when you try to scale this out to, let's say, like a large enterprise, a lot of computers these days have more than 8 gigs of RAM, some have more than 16 gigs of RAM. Like that's just a lot of information that you're trying to pull back and analyze, and when your methodology is have to pull back and analyze, like that's where you can get into some issues there. Services are a classic persistence method because it's how a lot of operating systems maintain persistence. It's a long-term process that's going to be running, and a lot of these are started either like on an event, so like on boot, or triggered by another event, which make them a natural, essentially a natural area for an attacker to put persistence because it's a built-in functionality. As far as offense goes, a lot of time it's going to require admin privileges. However, certain services aren't properly configured, so a non-admin user could modify a service binary or essentially could replace a service binary. As far as defense goes, if you require digital signatures or whitelisting or prevent these kinds of modifications, that would be a good defensive measure. As far as detection goes, services are actually fairly noisy when they start up, restart, stop, fail. This would be kind of one of those areas where you could maybe see an adversary toying with this or changing settings, and you might be able to catch them there. Scheduled jobs are kind of like services, except for essentially you're setting when you want the event to fire. So scheduled tasks, either through like SCTASK or cron, depending on the operating system or platform. As far as offense goes, to run administrative code, you're probably going to need administrative privileges to schedule that task. As far as defense goes, you could disable scheduled tasks or jobs. And as far as detection goes, it's really not super easy. We took a look, we opened up a Windows 7 box, and we decided to take a look at here's all of the scheduled tasks that exist on the system. I looked at Skip, I asked Skip, hey, do you know every single one of these and what it does? And then he looked at me and asked me the same question. So we're gonna go ahead and say this isn't easy. So this one's really interesting, MOF files, so it's a managed object format. Essentially, if you speak sim, this is a directory that's trawled and then code gets executed based off of the files that are in this directory. The directory is right up there. As far as defense goes, there's not really a great method for defending against this. As far as detection goes, not really a great method here either. However, if you're seeing modifications in this directory or new files show up, that's probably a pretty good indicator that something funky might be happening. So we put no good method, but again, like this is an opportunity for file integrity monitoring. We put maybe because scaling these kinds of detection measures can be really tricky. So as far as persistence goes, I put the inner tubes here, like the web. Essentially, if an attacker has access to modify a website, like a landing portal or something else, that's going to get accessed when a user, let's say it's the home page when you open up your browser, essentially you don't necessarily need persistence to be at the level of the operating system. If persistence is like, if all the information that I need is in the browser, or if I simply just, if JavaScript is good enough, like in this day and age with so much information being in the applications, really, I think this is a very valid persistence technique. As far as offense goes, you can either modify or set up custom web servers. As far as defense goes, you could possibly do URL whitelisting or monitoring. And then you're going to want to be able to detect the URLs that your users are visiting or monitor changes. So if you have a trusted internal portal and that gets changed, like that's going to be a really good trigger for making sure that something bad's not happening there. DNS is a really interesting persistence mechanism. You see it a lot on the level of like one host, which is very different than, let's say, DNS persistence at the level of an enterprise. So I mean, if I can go ahead and add records to an enterprise, like this could be a very, very bad day for everybody. Whereas if I'm just modifying the host files on a single host, like definitely could be obnoxious. I mean, some of the stuff you're going to see more like on a red team, on an assessment, an exercise, something like that. But it's definitely a valid way of modifying the system to enable persistence. As far as defense goes, you've got to be able to control where your clients get DNS from. It can be very hard because DNS is by default a plain text unauthenticated protocol. As far as detection goes, you could do FIM on the scale of one single system, just looking for modifications of the host file. Or you could do integrity monitoring for DNS records, because essentially it's just a mapping. So if you see the names start to get mapped to different numbers, although with load balancing, that'd be problematic. So this is one of my personal favorites. My first job in IT, I learned what elf bowling was. So essentially, persistence can be maintained if I can just send something to target's users and they're just going to open it. Like that's still persistence. Like as long as they will continue to do the same behavior reliably. I mean, it's the dancing cats. Like if you can prevent all users from clicking on all of the dancing cats, then you don't need to worry about this. But otherwise, defense is like how many times have, I mean, training against phishing, spear phishing. I think a lot of us have probably done like the mandatory, like to get access to the network training, like don't click on the dancing cats. As far as detection goes, email lives in so many different places that detection really isn't that hard. There's forensic artifacts all over the place for this. So it's essentially like once you bust the email, you can go back through either, you know, cache locally on systems, email servers. There's so many purpose-built devices for this that detection really just isn't that difficult. Out-of-band management can be really tricky. Essentially, if you have an attacker that can send traffic to like a DRAC or an ILO, here it's sometimes really hard to find these devices. They usually hide in weird corners of the network. But when you do find them, it's usually during a pen test that more often than not, you run into something with a default configuration, which can be really tricky. As far as defense goes, identifying and isolating these kinds of devices just because we know they're problematic is a really good measure. And then detection, it's really difficult because these are very specific systems. You could possibly, you know, alert on all of this traffic, but again, like detection's not going to be easy. Remote management is a part of these systems. It's what they're designed for. So re-exploitation, I think, is the persistence mechanism that people often forget about. Essentially, like you're looking for persistence because you started out from the assumption like, hey, somebody might be in my network. So essentially, like a lot of folks will focus on like, hey, this one time they came in this way and they did this, like A, B, C, D, E, F. Well, if I can still go back to A and re-exploit the network, like it's still persistence. Like, I mean, we kind of talked about it at the beginning of the talk, like why would you want persistence? Because it's not easy to just go back in and knock over the network. But going back in and knocking over the network again is still a completely valid persistence technique. So as far as offense goes, if it's there, it's there. As far as defense goes, timely patching, making sure that you're continually rolling back over and checking assumptions and making sure that defensively you have those layers. That can be really helpful. And then as far as detection goes, detection of compromised computers is really the purpose of this entire part of the slide. So go back through the deck. That's really what detection looks like. As far as conclusions go, so some of this stuff is really easy to defend against, some of it's not. Even after every device on the network is hardened, don't forget about the network. I mean, protecting against persistence isn't just like, hey, we've scrubbed this one asset completely clean and we can assure that this one asset will stay clean. Everything's connected, so beware of that complexity and be aware of it. Don't forget about the application layer, so web shells, JavaScript. It doesn't have to necessarily be a binary on a system. Like myevilcode.exe is not necessarily going to be the way that attackers maintain persistence in a network. Please do use this talk and essentially like we did the stoplight chart, so it'd be easy to go back through this talk for folks. But go back through, use this talk to try and talk about resources, outlooks, and scope, and please make a solid game plan for raising the bar for attackers. That's, yeah. So now we have some time for questions.
A lot of time for questions.
Or a lot of time for questions because I talked pretty fast. I can also go, like, we can go back through any of these if folks have questions about a specific technique.
Yeah, I'm surprised you included malware as a persistent.
So that's a really valid point. So the question / statement is, we're really surprised that you included memory persistent malware as a persistence technique. So again, persistence is about being in place for a period of time. So like, let's say that I'm on a domain controller. I can persist on a domain controller that might not get rebooted for 3 to 5 to 6 to however many months at a time. So it was really just talking about, like, a lot of the goal in the talk was to try and challenge assumptions about persistence. So yeah, like, I asked the same question, but ultimately, like, when we just rack stacked everything, we continued to include it because, yeah, for a system that doesn't get rebooted, like, just running in memory is a totally valid way to persist. So it might help if you think of it more on the level of like a backdoor. So like, if I run my backdoor code and I don't want it sitting there on disk, I can just hang out in memory.
And I've actually seen a domain controller that hadn't been rebooted in 4 years. So if someone started something on that 3.5 years ago, it's still there. They considered it too fragile to touch, too fragile to patch, too fragile to reboot. It's inside their trusted enclave. So, you know, they never rebooted it. So if you were able to get on to the DC, you were able to hang out, you can dump hashes anytime you want, you can do anything you want to them from there. I mean, sort of the definition of persistence at that point.
Regarding the defense on scheduled tasks, you mentioned disabling scheduled tasks, and that interfere with the 100 or so default scheduled tasks?
So yeah, so usually for situations like that, that's why you'd see in the upper right-hand corner that it wasn't low for defense. Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about is, I mean, essentially like how we drafted the talk is we mapped out the entire, like, you know, startup and running state of a system and of a network, and we tried to look at different spots. And a lot of these persistence mechanisms are leveraging like known functionality or essentially like regular behavior, like a service. You want your services to start. When I start a machine, I want my services to start. So it really becomes more about validating those types of things than it is about like completely disabling or turning them off. But with all of these, we did want to at least try to open up the thought exercise of what does defense against something like this look like.
Is it possible to limit the ability to have scheduled tasks and only the admins can do it on every month?
Well, right. I mean, so there's the whole thing about like privilege levels. So especially like for Microsoft operating systems, as time has progressed, like we've moved away from just using to using tasks and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's definitely stuff that you can do to try and control like what level things are persisted in. But I mean, like the startup folder, like if I don't have privileges or permissions to write to or modify certain other operating system components, and I just want to be like persistent across power cycles, like it really like, so it's about what kind of persistence you want also. So if that made sense. So validation and then understanding kind of different impacts.
Well, and the other thing is, like, you know, take for example the average Windows 7 desktop where we had over 100 things. You know, it's stuff like the disk indexing, you know, so the search functionality. You know, if you actually disable SCH, if you actually fully disable the task scheduler, what would break? You know, have you tried it? You know, is there some critical piece of functionality, you know? And, you know, a lot of them may be scheduling an auto update for Java. I mean, there's any number of hundreds of things that this thing is doing in the background that the average person doesn't know about. So maybe you just disable it, see what happens. You know, like Will said, it's meant to be sort of a thought exercise to look at why can't you do it rather than why shouldn't you, you know? So anyway.
Back to like firmware and libraries that are basically much more defense once it's detected. So why can't you just, or as a preventative measure, why can't you just go to the rest of the part of your life cycle, reflash, know that the real?
Well, I mean, yeah. So his question was, with the firmware, you know, there isn't really a lot of good defense. And so his question was, why don't you, as part of your life cycle, just reflash? And depending on the size of your organization, you may be able to get away with that.
You build that in your equipment.
So,
Right. Well, but so for example, if I have a location that has 10,000 switches, you know, each one of those is a potential landing spot for a firmware bug. So, you know, what kind of time and energy has to go into to managing that, you know, on a flash, you know, each one of these is a floor that goes down in a building somewhere for X amount of time while you reflash. And I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but it's something that, you know, there's a time and a cost associated with, you know, going and reflashing. And you also, you know, you can trust that your firmware, you know, if you go download it from Cisco's website, you run your checksums on it, you know, and you go push it out, you know, if the firmware is compromised, how do you know that the firmware update process is going to actually install properly? So, I mean, this is, it's not an easy thing to solve. And, you know, we've seen supply chain attacks that have actually made it, you know, out of the realm of theory into, you know, the realm of probable. So, but yeah, certainly you could look at doing something like that.
I can see this being useful, so thanks. But I'd like to throw it in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that for my organization or the slides available.
Oh yeah, we'll put the slides up. Let's see, did I? Yeah, I didn't put my Twitter on here. I'm at passing the hash. Yep. So I will make sure that I get this posted up on my blog, and I'll put a link out on Twitter. So, yeah, Rob?
What's the longest lived persistence method in your experience that you've seen? What lasted the longest?
So, go ahead and repeat the question.
So the question was from Rob in the back. What's the longest lived persistence method that we've ever seen out of all of these? And I'll answer for me. So the longest lived persistence method that I've seen was actually in a super high security organization that spent a lot of time baselining their systems and networks. They spent a lot of time looking at defense and defensive measures. However, they also baselined in a few services that weren't legitimate services, and that persisted for over 3 years. So, yeah. I mean, essentially, it's when you asked your question. I mean, you're asking like, hey, like, how do we do this? Like, validation and understanding and constantly cycling back over is really the moral of the story for persistence. But yeah, so services actually, yeah, just old-fashioned.
So your question is, for the hypervisor, could file integrity monitoring help at all in that situation? The problem is that you're operating at the hypervisor level. So is there a tripwire for ESXi? And I don't believe there is. The VMDKs, the virtual disks, are going to be constantly changing. The memory is going to be constantly changing. I don't know that there really is any sort of good way to perform any sort of file integrity monitoring. I mean, I don't know if there is something that goes through and checksums all of the files on ESXi. Yeah, apparently we're missing out. Now, if you gave him one of those bottles of whiskey, we'll see what happens. But
If you would have given me that at the beginning of the talk.
oh, at the beginning of the talk. All right. Any other questions or anything?
Talk about management of the format.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead, man.
All right, so I don't know. We were actually at DerbyCon last night, and yeah, one of my pieces of homework is to go back home to Redmond and understand the full history of MOF files and MOF and where this all came from and where it's going. Yeah, so essentially, like, you put a MOF file in the directory and it gets executed. That's pretty much there's tons of layers beneath that, but essentially for persistence and for attacking machines, that's the level of understanding necessary. It's on by default.
Somehow in like Visual Studio, you can set a MOF as a target. You drop it in the directory and magic happens. As far as like the history or how it got there, why it's there still. I know a number of people that thought that it had actually been removed at XP, but it's still there. So it's a bit of a black hole.
You can buy Matt a beer. He's sitting right in front of you. He might be able to tell you more, or be willing to tell you more.
I'll talk about it during my talk.
Oh, okay.
See, there we go.
Yeah, see, there's a plug for Matt Graber's talk in 20 minutes.
Beer too.
All right, any other questions? All right, I guess it's time to go line up for Matt's talk. I was trying to get